Welcome to the Book Fest. I'm your host, Beth A. Freely, and today I have the wonderful opportunity to sit down and have a one-to-one conversation with true crime investigator and author Doug Kari. In case Doug's name sounds familiar, he is the man who exposed the Burman Murders. In 1986, Barry Berman, the heir to the Kahlua fortune, and his wife Louise went missing in the Saline Valley, a popular Mojave Desert draw for nudists and eccentrics. Dave brings to us a blend of scholarly research and good old-fashioned storytelling in his writing, and he believes in immersive investigation, which has led him to lay aside inside the grave of a murder victim to envision the carnage that befell moments before death. And I'm going to start right off with that one, Doug. What was that experience like? Tell us what that was like.
Well, Beth, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here talking with you. And there was a lead up to that. It took me a couple of tries way out here in the middle of nowhere to find that gravesite. In the intervening years, the instructions that were in the case files that had been provided to me by the sheriff's office were no longer accurate because there had been flash floods that had altered the course of the very rough Jeep trail that led out there. So I had to kind of account for that and then just do a lot of hiking around. Very lonely spot, very stark, but very beautiful. So when I arrived on the scene, and then it was there, you know, the cairn from the photos was still there, the same bushes, everything lined up. The grave itself was, the gravesite itself was in a what's called a cut bank, where a trough that had been carved by flash flooding over the years. And trying to put myself in the mindset of understanding this as a gravesite after I've been hiking around and looking for so long,
Right.
I wanted to somehow transform my way of looking at it. And as I got closer and I looked, I just thought the best way to really understand what happened here is to lie down on my back and just look up and imagine the horror of what took place there as they were murdered, and then their bodies were stacked and then concealed with rocks and sand so that they wouldn't be discovered for several years later.
That's some serious immersive investigation for story writing. That takes a strong person to do. So what got you started in this kind of investigation, in this kind of immersion? Was there some sort of particular event in your own life that made you more curious about this kind of investigating or writing? How did you get so involved with this?
Well, in my case, it was really the cart came before the horse in a way, Beth. It was more that I fell in love with the desert. And then because of that love of the desert, I got drawn into writing about crime stories in the deserts of California and Nevada. My love of the desert arose from an amazing woman, my grandmother, who, after my grandfather died, moved into the middle of a lonely Mojave Desert valley. She had a little artist's cabin, kerosene lamps for light, a wood stove, and she drove a big four-wheel drive truck. Before four-wheel drives were really a thing, sometimes she would strap on a 44 pistol on her waist, and she had a very spiritual outlook. She felt that she could talk to rattlesnakes and commune with nature, and I believe her. I mean, she was an amazing woman, and it was my relationship with her, you know, as a kid, this almost mythical figure in what otherwise was kind of a normal, you know, family, and going out and visiting her just fired my imagination. She was also a collector of desert relics, so she had a couple of old sheds on her property where she kept mining relics and things that she'd found in the years that she'd wandered the desert. So I just, because of her, I got pulled into the desert, and that's how I got pulled into writing about true crime.
I can understand that fascination with someone who grew up in a desert. My husband is from Carlsbad, New Mexico, and we recently moved back out here to be closer to his family. We live in a little town called Hope that's got 100 people, and that's it. So we're always finding little interesting things. I mean, he came into the house one day holding a skull, and I'm like, what is that? And he's like, it's a gopher skull. And I was like, okay, that's pretty cool. So I can understand how that would definitely influence, your type of love of the desert, and getting into that investigative kind of mindset, because, I go out in my own yard and I'm always looking for interesting things, because, you never know what you're going to find. So talk to me some more about how you got involved with some of these cases that you got involved in, because obviously you have that very investigative mindset. You have that curiosity that a lot of people don't have, that a lot of people don't understand if they've also never been in the desert or around the desert or lived in areas like this.
Well, you were talking about your husband finding a gopher
A gopher
skull.
skull. Yeah.
If you walk through the desert and you have your head on a swivel and you're looking here and there, you see
Hmm.
a lot of bones, and now and then maybe some just very incongruous sign of a human, like a single old weathered shoe. And you're
Right.
trying to imagine, like, how did this shoe get here? Was somebody wearing it and it came off of them? Or I remember one time finding the entire hoof of a
Right.
burro with a and thinking, "That must have been a pretty bad moment in that animal's life when that whole thing
Yeah.
came off,"
Yeah.
but the rest of the animal was nowhere to be found, and this wasn't in a spot where you would expect water to carry things, just, like, in a kind of a stable looking area. There's just this hoof. Did an animal carry it there? What happened? And so, the desert does fire your imagination and make you think about things like that, more particularly journalism. I mean, my background, I was a an English major at Berkeley. I read
Right.
a
Yeah.
lot. I love books just like you do, and always wanted to write. And then I became, don't hold it against me, but I became a lawyer and still am a lawyer. I'm in house at a technology company now, but I also practiced law, did courtroom work for
Right.
years, and so that taught me about some of the research skills that translate well into investigative journalism, as well as the doggedness that you need to pursue something, and how to deal with pushback. For example, just a couple of weeks ago, I won a court order against a recalcitrant public agency that didn't want to turn over records and said, well, to get
Hmm.
that, you need a
Hmm.
court order. And I said, oh, okay,
Okay.
court order. Yeah. All right, let's go. So, and what I found as I got into different subjects, because I've covered things like the migrant crisis down in Mexico,
Right.
and
Right.
I wrote a travel piece that was a cover story on the travel section of a newspaper, and I thought that was an interesting genre as well. But the crime cases are just intriguing, and there's a lot of appetite for it too. So you've got
Mhm.
people who want to read about it. And then I found as a writer, wow, it's really interesting to write about this. So the two kind of come together. It's for me, it's more fulfilling to write about something where there's an eager audience rather than, 4 or 5 people who want to read it. And it just so happened that dovetailed with what I found as I went on in writing, that the crime stuff is really fascinating. It's a bit addictive. You get hooked on it trying to figure out these
Mhm.
puzzles.
Well, and we've also heard about different journalists over the years who have cracked cases. They've made movies about different journalists. The one that's coming to mind, of course, is the Zodiac Killer, and what the newspaper reporters and the journalists did, through all of that. Do you find that you get a lot of pushback when you start doing this kind of in-depth digging, where they really just don't want you to get involved, and you have to stay dogged about it?
Sometimes. I just published a piece in the Las Vegas Review Journal uh, about a sheriff who had engaged in some election shenanigans. The story kind of came to
Mhm.
me on a tip, And yeah, they didn't want to turn over some of the records that they had, but I was able to get them from another source and expose that story. But it does, there is an involvement sometimes, a deeper involvement of the journalist
Mhm.
and the story than you might have in other kinds of reporting and writing. And I find that to be part of it. In the Burman murders, uh,
Mhm.
without giving away too much, part of what happened was that a cover story I wrote for LA Weekly generated some leads from prison informants and
Oh,
contributed
interesting.
and that contributed to our overall understanding of the case, because keep in mind, this is a cold case where there's never been an arrest.
Right,
There's
right.
nobody's been charged, nobody's been convicted, but there is a theory, there is a suspect. So what I've done in the book is a deep dive into what the evidence is and try to show you in an impartial way where it seems to lead, but then let the reader draw their own conclusions. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Just
exactly.
not,
Yes.
I'm not trying to force your head into the water in the book. I'm leading you to the water, or more than that, showing how the evidence appears to lead to the water. Up to you though, whether to say no, I don't think this is the answer, or that does seem to be the answer. And that's one of the things too that I like, Beth, about true crime writing,
Mhm.
is that you do get into some of the gray areas and the uncertainties. And that's
Right.
fascinating too. And I think the readers who are drawn to it are often very intelligent, intuitive people who want to come in and solve these puzzles. They don't necessarily want to be spoon fed a story.
They want to dive into those more esoteric points that may come out of, that investigation, especially from the journalistic side. They want to know more about that. I have a journalism background myself. I hold a bachelor's in journalism and a master's in English and creative writing, so kind of the best of both worlds. Before we get into the Berman murders, I want to ask you. Um, you mentioned being impartial. Do you find it harder nowadays to hold on to that journalistic impartiality that we were taught to have as journalists, as compared to some of our peers who might want to lean one way or the other?
Well, fortunately, the kind of journalism that I'm doing isn't tied to some of the political upheaval of today, and
Yeah,
those tides that are shifting back and forth, which don't interest me at all. Sort of the
same here.
ebb and
Yeah,
flow of politics, I
yeah.
could care less. And my readers clearly fall in various political camps. Of of course, you may start to form opinions or sensibilities when you get drawn into looking at a case, but it's really important to be conscious of that. You're going to
Mhm.
feel some of that, but you can't surrender to it. You can't engage in confirmation bias. You can't let your own opinions, your own feelings sway an impartial evaluation of the evidence. Now, the evidence may start to lead in a particular direction, and you don't have to be shy about saying it seems to be pointing this way,
Right.
and analyze the evidence and present it in a forceful
Pull that
way. That
to pull
that's
that
that's
little thread.
yeah, that's okay. That's okay, but to come in with a preconceived notion or to let your own emotions sway the direction, you can see that kind of thing sometimes, and I particularly don't like it. I like to be shown
Yeah.
where do the facts lead, and that's what I try to do in the reporting, while still having a story out of it. There is a story to be told. It's not
Mhm.
all dry and factual. There's a lot of color and storytelling that goes into something like this. I love it as an art form, as I know you do. I mean, I know you're
Yeah.
deeply
Yeah.
committed to writing from your background up until today. So we share that.
That investigative part really, I find that so fascinating because it's not something we all get to do very often. And I might do a little bit of it with my fiction writing, but not on the same level that you're doing. Um, how have you ever had a hard time maintaining your credibility with some of the research that you found? Has that research ever taken you down a road that has made someone question your credibility, and how did you recover from that?
Well, you're going to get questioned from time to time, but for the most part, I've found that my stories are well received. Don't yet have the experience that some journalists have had of coming under hard attack. But I have, that said, Beth, I have run into sources or people who are rather hostile to what it is that I'm trying to do. Not everybody embraces it when you go on one of these missions. Some people would rather just leave it alone, or they have a preconceived notion, and if they don't get the idea that you're going the same direction where they are, they get
Hmm.
they get you get pushback. And I've encountered that kind of hostility. The way I approach it generally, I mean, if it's a source that I'm trying to tap into, I want to hear their perspective. What I've
Hmm.
found is that because some of the stories I work on have a rather long maturation period. Some of the journalism, I mean, boom, you get in, you get the facts, it needs to be reported, it's
Right.
timely. But the Burman murders, I was on that project for a 9-year span. And during that time, people who initially pushed back on me and said, no, never, they're not going to talk to me, several of them ended up feeling like, you keep coming back on this and you've put in the time, maybe I will talk to you. And I found that folks got more willing to engage with me when they saw that I was serious about it and I wasn't just trying to get a quick hit of a story with all the salacious facts and then move on. True crime writing has plenty of salacious facts. If you like
Oh yeah.
all of the
Oh yeah.
stuff associated with crime, you're going to get a lot of it in the reporting that I do. But you don't have to play that up and make it all about that. I try to get into
Right.
the root causes of what happened. The facts will fascinate you, horrify you, do all those things, but my mission is to get underneath that and try to understand root causes.
So how can the average person tell the difference between the type of investigative writing that you're doing as compared to the sensation seekers who are just trying to make a fast buck off of those salacious, facts and the dirt, behind some of these investigations?
What you'll see in a lot of true crime journalism, Beth, is that people are simply repackaging what's already out there, maybe
Hmm.
packaging it into an attractive podcast or packaging it into a story with a different kind of format, but they're not really breaking new ground. And if you're really into a story, what happens is as something is written about it, you look at it and you think, oh my gosh, is there going to be anything new in here? Is there some breaking news? And you realize, oh,
Hmm.
it's just a rehash. It's a repackage of what I already know. And I'd like to think anybody who reads any of my work will think, "Wow, there's a lot of stuff in here I didn't know before." And that's my goal. My goal is to be the definitive source on the things I report about. Now, for example, when I reported on the massacre of moms and kids down in northern Mexico from the breakaway
Right.
Mormon colony
Right.
several years
Yeah.
ago, I mean, there was major international reporting going on that. Some very
I
fine
remember seeing
reporters.
that. Hmm.
Yeah, there were good people, but even then, I was able to get in and do original research by finding family members and others who, with some persistence, I could get to talk to me, and so I was able to break some new ground. And when I was reporting on the migrant crisis down in Mexico, the migrant caravans, there was a lot of talk in the early days about migrant caravans. What
Right.
I was able to find people and get into places that other people wouldn't just by getting in and looking. And I got some good photos by being willing to literally get down on my hands and knees. One of my favorite photos that I've ever had published is of a little toddler in a migrant
Mhm.
encampment playing in the mud after a particularly rough night of rains and upheaval. And while CNN was a quarter mile away, causing a big hullabaloo with their film crew, and I was lying in the mud to take pictures of this toddler. And I was very proud of the juxtaposition between the guys who weren't getting their feet dirty versus, me coming out with mud all over me, because I really wanted the picture of that little boy, because there are times when a picture is worth 1,000 words, and
Oh,
that was one of them.
definitely. I mean, we've seen that, through covers of Life magazine all our lives, that where there's always that one picture that just strikes the heart, and everybody's like, what is the story here? And I think that actually brings the human element into it. I mean, yes, we hear about the migrant crisis, we hear about the Mormon moms, we hear about, kids who are kidnapped or missing and everything, but that story takes a turn from just a news story to a human story when investigative journalists like you come in and really, remind everyone, hey, these are humans, these are people too, and they have feelings, and let's show them that. With the exception of the Berman case, has there been one case in particular that has struck you the most poignantly?
Yes, the Carly Goose case, and it continues to just torment me. Most of the cases that I report on, I can maintain a degree of emotional involvement while still not having it wake me up all the time at night. But
Right.
that's not to say I don't feel these cases. I
Oh
don't
yeah,
think
no,
you can
I'm
be
sure you
effective.
do. Yeah.
I don't think you can be effective if you don't let it get inside you somewhat and really affect you. But there's something about just the utter absence of evidence with respect to Carly Goose. She was 16 years old, living in a rural area in a little neighborhood in the eastern Sierra near the Nevada border, and she'd had a bad night down in town. She'd gotten high and kind of had a bad drug experience. She was scared, so she called her mom. Her mom came and picked her up, and they stayed up all night chatting and everything. And
Mhm.
finally, early in the morning, her mom and her both fall asleep on her bed, and her mom, her stepmom to be precise, wakes up and Carly's gone. She goes out, her cell phone is sitting on a counter in the kitchen, which is a bit troubling. And a lot of people pointed fingers at the stepmom. Stepmom was an easy target here. And in
Oh
fact, the
yeah,
stepmom
yeah.
posted some videos afterwards that they were weird. But I mean, I've been in that house. I've been in that
Mhm.
room. I've talked to the family. I talked to the boys whose room was just down the hall. But more importantly than assessing the scene myself, I interviewed two neighbors independently who both corroborated that Carly was out of the house in the morning in sweatpants and a t shirt. She seemed fine. She was looking around, looking up at the sky, and both of them said she had a piece of paper in her hand. Now,
Mm.
all these books I've collected over the years, I'd give every one of those books to know what was on that one piece of paper. So
Yeah.
she was then spotted down by Highway 6, this lonely desert highway, early in the morning on Saturday. Somebody driving by spotted her down there. And then, Beth, that was it. She was gone, like she vanished off the face of the planet. If there ever was such a thing as a UFO abduction, this might have been it.
That could have been it. Yeah,
But
exactly.
but
Exactly.
I think more likely that she got into a car willingly or unwillingly. It's possible she just
Mhm.
kept walking and walked so far and wide and then holed away somewhere that her remains were never found. I don't think it's likely she's alive at this point, because I think she would have been heard from if she was a runaway or whatever.
Oh, for
I,
sure. Yeah.
I think it's
Yeah.
possible she was abducted, as statistically rare as that is, especially on a lonely road. Very unlikely statistically. But the thing is, lightning does strike sometimes, and this may
Yes.
be one of those cases. But not just me, Beth, everybody who's gotten close to this case is just tormented by it, because here's this beautiful girl, a
Hmm.
child, just a young girl with a whole life ahead, and she's just gone. And
Just gone.
there's
Yeah.
no clues.
Nothing.
There's nothing. There's nothing, Beth. It's just, that's a hard one. That's a really hard one for me.
Yeah, I can hear in your voice, and how you talk about it, that one hits home. That one really hits home. Um, let's talk about the Berman case. Um, you put out the book about the Berman murders. What really got you super involved in this case? What struck your fancy about this that made you get involved?
Well, first of all, I want to mention that the publisher, Roman and Littlefield, has really done a great job in helping me uh, have my first book be one that's physically of really nice quality, and that it has some top-notch editing involved with it too. So many people contributed to this story, and I'm very grateful to have a good agent and a strong, reputable publisher behind me. And I think
Yes.
part of the reason that I was able to do that is, one, that I've been able to develop a base of readers who are really good, smart people. Some of the comments and the feedback I get, I mean, there's a lot of women drawn to true crime stories,
Oh
and
yeah.
these folks are smart, and they're intuitive. What drew me into the case was where it happened. Saline Valley, which is now part of Death Valley National Park, is a remarkable area, Beth. It's very isolated. Just the paved road that you take there kind of feels like it's in the middle of nowhere. And then
Mhm.
you start the real journey into Saline Valley, which is 50 miles of rough dirt road, which is sometimes impassable depending on weather conditions or landslides. I mean, just
Right.
getting in there is a challenge. Then when you do get in there, it's just a world apart, completely silent, beautiful valley ringed by tall mountains with sand dunes and a saline lake that kind of looks like the dull silver color. It's
Mhm.
visually and emotionally just a remarkable spot. Then, culturally, in the middle of this valley is this oasis that's kind of a counterculture mecca, where people come, take off their clothes, soak in these hot springs. What's happened over the years is that the water has been piped from the natural springs into these beautiful soaking pools, and there's a whole culture that surrounds this now, and people who go out there. It's not uncommon to drive into camp and you see somebody with a big hat, sunglasses, and sandals and nothing else on, just
And nothing
walking.
else.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but it's not a place of licentiousness or random hookups. It's not a singles bar.
Now
It's more about,
I've heard it's actually very good for your health, soaking in those hot springs and everything actually.
it is, and it's a place where people commune with nature, talk
Mhm.
with each other. Sometimes there's partying; people will be sharing alcohol or passing joints or whatever. But it's not it's not a place of wild abandon. It's much more thoughtful than that. And
Mhm.
when Barry and Louise, who had had some marital problems, she was quite a bit older than him, 17 years older. He was
Ooh, that is a
younger.
big difference,
He
yeah.
he was the heir apparent to a massive fortune, and she had had a complex relationship history. She'd been a 1960s wild child, and when they finally connected and got married, they had some issues. They were both disciples of a Punjabi guru named Charan Singh, and they were very committed to meditation as a form of expression and development of their own faith. They
Right.
believe the soul travels through multiple lifetimes. And they also believed that the killing of animals gives rise to bad karma. And they were very peaceful, gentle people. So they go out into the middle of this extraordinary desert wilderness, which at that point I'd been going out there for many years. So I was well aware of the location. And they got up one morning and took a walk and just never came back. And when those of us who were familiar with the area started hearing talk about this, it was like, what? And the assumption was maybe they'd gotten lost or something, although, I mean, there was this massive search that took place. And then when their bodies turned up in a cut bank grave several years later, it really cast a pall over the whole aura out there. When
Right.
I found out about it, I was stunned, and it changed my perspective. I was much less likely to engage with strangers, and when I would go out there with my family, I mean, all my kids, we baptized them in a waterfall that comes off one of the mountains. We went deep into a canyon off one of the surrounding mountains and baptized the kids there. I mean, I'm deeply tied to that area, but
Right.
I
Right.
became very wary about strangers, and it gnawed at me, Beth, over the years. I couldn't let go of it. And so I don't know, it just came back to me one day, and I thought, I want to start digging in. So I started making calls, and it just one thing led to another, and it became this 9-year odyssey.
Yeah, you actually, being familiar with the area, you watched it going from this very peaceful Zen kind of area to now having this ghastly pall over it as a almost like a murder scene, you know, and not really, I can see where where it would change perspectives. So when you decided, when it started gnawing at you, how did you go about starting the journey to the book? I mean, where did you start your research?
I've done a lot of desert exploration and mountaineering. I talked about how
Mhm.
that valley is ringed by mountains. I've spent a
Right,
lot of
right.
time exploring in those mountains. They're very rugged. Uh, there, there are some trail systems, but a lot of times you're just navigating up ridges or down canyons, and it can be quite challenging to get around in there. And over the years, I did a lot of desert mountaineering in those areas with guys who were well skilled, and we
Right.
had really, really intense adventures up in those mountains. And one of the guys in particular that I'd done a lot of desert exploration with, a guy named Morgan Irby, was a firefighter, really strong, almost like a caricature, with a shaved head and big muscles. I mean, he's like a unique character. This is a guy who got up one day out at those hot springs and
Uh-huh.
decided to go for a run. Catch this. So he decides to go for a run. So what does he do? He puts on army boots, nothing else, and runs 15 miles out and 15 miles back.
50 miles back.
Yeah, does a 30-mile round trip around naked. Can you imagine if you were camping out somewhere, and you're just having a peaceful desert morning, suddenly this big monster of a guy comes clomping in his army boots? Oh my God, I'd run for dear life. But Morgan is just extraordinary, and he's got a mind like you wouldn't believe. He remembers everything that he sees or hears, and he can quote from Shakespeare and the Bible and Arthur Miller, and
Wow.
he's just one of these kind of characters. They only made one of him, and that was my first phone call, because he is very dialed in with a lot of the things and the people out there, and he was able to say, well, you should call this person or call that person, and that is what got me started.
Awesome. I think that's great. We're coming down to about 10 minutes. So tell us a little bit more about where we can find your book and how we can go ahead and get a copy, and let's give the audience a little taste of of what all
Yeah.
you've got here.
All right. Well, thank you for asking. The book is called The Burman Murders, as you probably see. I set a copy back up here deliberately. It doesn't normally live there. I will fess up to that. It's because I want you to be able to see it. It's widely
Yeah.
available, Beth. It's on Barnes and Noble and Amazon. I do think that Rowman and Littlefield, the publisher, is still offering a pre-ordered discount. I don't
There you
know
go.
how long that discount lasts, but you can go to Roman and Littlefield's site, ROWMAN. You can also come to my website and link to it. It's just Doug Kari. Kari is spelled Kari, just dougkari.com. And you can find it there. I've also got Doug Kari author Facebook page. I'm on Instagram, and you can
Perfect.
get to the book that direction. But if you just Google it, you'll see it pop up in a lot of places. And I'd love to have more people read it. The reviews have been good. I'm very happy with that. Like a lot of people who get involved in this, I'm not tied to particular feedback or
Mhm.
outcomes. I do my best, and then whatever happens. But it's nice to see when people
Oh
do
yeah, for
connect
sure.
with it and say nice things. Yeah, you can't
For
help
sure.
but feel good. I've gotten some really nice reviews. It did. It was riding at the top of some Amazon category that I think is kind of narrow and obscure, something
Nice.
about forensic law, but still it was nice to see
There
this
you go.
banner that said #1 new release. So that's always nice, and I'd love to have people engage with it. As far as a little more about the book,
Mhm.
it's organized. I'll give you a little bit of how it runs. So I start off with their disappearance, because that seems like the right place to start,
Right.
and then from there into the search, and then we step back a bit and follow Barry and Louise's journey into the desert, which takes them past some geographical locations that tie into their earlier lives. So I use that as a vehicle for telling you about who these folks are, so that by the time they actually get out to where the crime occurred, you know who they are and the journey that
Right.
brought them there. And then after they're gone, you see these efforts, these heroic efforts that were made by especially by this one dogged deputy named Leon Boyer, who just tried for
Mhm.
years to figure this case out. And then you start to see where the evidence leads towards a particular suspect, and that takes you in a different direction, because at that point we have to go across to the other side of the world to follow his path and to see how things that he did years later may shed light on his personality and motives for what could have occurred out in the desert. So it covers a wide time span in 258 pages. It's deeply researched. I take a lot of the side
Mhm.
tracks and things and put them into footnotes. But if you're
Right.
really into it, you can go to the back and get into a lot of depth there. And on my website, I have more photos and things for readers to enjoy.
I love following those little side quests. There's always some interesting little nuggets in those. So definitely we'll be following some of the side quests there. Real quick, tell us real quick about your work with desert survivors.
Oh, desert survivors. Well, again, that ties to Saline Valley and the California desert in particular. So, my grandmother, who I told you about, was a prospector.
Right.
She was very tied to the mining community. I went in a bit of a different direction. Got involved in desert conservation work. My approach to it was and continues to be one of a person who believes in a balance of uses. I'm not somebody who believes that the
Right.
desert should be completely locked up and made unavailable for the various historical uses. But it was my sense, as I fell in love with the desert and explored,
Mhm.
Beth, that there was a lot of disrespect shown towards the
Right.
desert and
Right.
its natural resources. So I got involved on the side of Desert Survivors. Desert Survivors is a group that I co-founded. We were and are a desert conservation and preservation group that leads a lot of trips into the desert, and we got involved in the wilderness protection movement, advocating, for example, for Saline Valley to
Right.
become part of Death Valley National Park, which
Right.
ultimately occurred. And I think the Park Service has done a great job in keeping it the way you would want it to be, which is just
Yeah.
that natural, They don't have a lot of signs out there. You still have to find your own way. You can still get lost. Take it
Yep.
from me. I don't usually take a map when I go out there because I feel like this is my backyard. But
Right,
as a
exactly.
result, sometimes I take a wrong turn. It's like, wait a minute, shouldn't I have made a right turn by now? It's like, yeah, you
Mhm.
should have. Those wheel tracks back there, that was your road, buddy. So, yeah.
And so one last thing. What would you tell any author or journalist who wants to get started in investigative, this type of investigative journalism? What is your advice to them?
My advice, very simple: do original work. Of course, you start with the open sources. I mean, first thing, go to the internet, read everything you can find, but reach beyond that. Don't just be somebody who repackages. Start making the phone calls,
Mhm.
knocking on doors, getting out to where things occurred and just looking around. Break new ground. There are very few people who do that, and I think that that's how you can make a better name for yourself and have more satisfaction out of it. It takes time, it takes energy, it takes an investment of resources. But if you do that, it's very fulfilling, and I think that would be my biggest piece of advice in a world where there isn't enough of that going on. Get in
Right.
there and really dig in.
Awesome. Doug, this has been a great conversation. Thank you for sharing your experience and your talent with us. And to everyone at the Book Fest, thank you for joining us today. Go get Doug's book. I will guarantee you it is one heck of a read. Until the next time, this is Beth A. Freely. Thanks again, Doug. You all take care.